the draft is filled, we'll see where the slot is going to be randomly generated for. And Shawn, it is the 102, so we don't have the flexibility maybe we wanted, but you touched there on a kind of a modified 0 RB or a hero RB approach. There's going to be the option here for us to get Jonathan Taylor or Christian McCaffrey. Is one of those guys going to be the option here, or are we going to look to get a wide receiver here to start our drafts? When we look at it, it is a 30-second timer, so things will move pretty rapidly through this draft.
They will, and it's just still so tempting to take Kupp or Jefferson, Jamar Chase. At the 102, you're going to get a slightly different build. I've witnessed other players doing it. I mean, you're not going to, that in and of itself isn't going to make you unique because drafters are taking the wide receivers that early in some drafts. I think that you'll have a chance if you're going to do a handful of these to get some picks more like we're talking about a little bit more in the middle and maybe hit your wide receivers there. You have so few chances to have the 101 or the 102, at least at times. Ben and I are always joking about how we had the 110 and later in virtually all of our high stakes drafts last year. When you get one of these slots and have a shot at one of these two running backs, I kind of think that you have to take it, but I'm willing to go in a different direction, Colm, if you prefer one of the wide receivers.
Well, I was going to say I've had a couple of these drafts so far, and I've gone for the wide receiver every time. So maybe to differentiate, and if we get the 104 at a later point, we can go wide receiver. Jonathan Taylor was off the board, so Christian McCaffrey would be that option. And I think for setting this up, I think we'll go with Christian McCaffrey. I think the wide receivers are very interesting there, but like you said, getting that first slot or the second slot doesn't always happen. I know Ben had a situation last year where it was kind of 9th or later the whole time, but so far this year I've kind of been from the 6th spot forward, so it's been going pretty good from that perspective. But like sometimes you just want to get that one at the back, so you're not taking the wide receiver maybe as early as you go. But I do think the startup ADP for these drafts is definitely the correct top 5. It's Kupp, Jefferson, and Chase that are going off the board after that, and the Kupp does go in the next pick. I'm actually interested. There's a team in this called OTISD picking in the 3rd slot. For anyone who used to listen to the Overtime Ireland podcast, shout out to them. But this going to be fun. So we have quite a bit of time here, Shawn, to get till our next pick. We'll be picking at the 211. But we did talk about some of the recent drafts that you've done with Zach and with Connor and the builds that have been able to be achieved in those. What are you thinking here? And I know you're probably already thinking at this point that you want to differentiate a little bit from the exact starts maybe in those drafts, but who are some of the options that we should be targeting here at the 2-3 turn? And ideally would be kind of dipping into 2 wide receivers, I think, at that point.
Yeah, you put together a cool video for us on YouTube from one of the shows where he talked about this contrast between potentially starting hyper fragile with a 1-2 type of slot, potentially going 0 running back with a slot late, and how the difference between Underdog and FFPC can actually facilitate that, because in Underdog, you're not necessarily going to get the top wide receivers coming back to you at the 211 or the 212. I'm going to be interested to see which guys come back, because if we do have a shot at a couple of elite wide receivers, it's tempting to have Christian McCaffrey and then to have those 2 elite guys. I'm also tempted to go the other route and continue to build some of these hyper fragile teams in the slots where you can actually do it, right? You're not looking to have this huge portfolio of hyper fragile teams, but you also have some limitations in terms of which slots you could even potentially execute it from. And so when we have those, I find that part very intriguing, especially if the specific targets are there. So I wouldn't even mind ending up with the same 3 guys that Connor and I started with, because you're going to end up with a quite different team the rest of the way.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to see, especially with the information that was gathered from that draft that you did, to see how that's kind of like a reconnaissance mission here for this draft with a similar start point as well. So we are now at the 112, and since that the last couple of picks have been Stephon Diggs, Najee Harris, Dalvin Cook, Devontae Adams, DeAndre Swift goes off the board at the 112. So Shawn, that was a player that you got the back of the 2nd round in your draft, so we won't be getting him there. I know Swift is somebody that we really like. He has been kind of going off the board in the 18th pick range. He goes 6 picks ahead of that in today's draft. What are your thoughts on Swift as early as that?
I think it's a good selection, right? And I think that you're going to end up with some unique teams with that selection so early. He ends up with Swift and Kelsey, 2 players that could end up being the league winner this season. This, I think, also illustrates, again, too, why we actually did start running back in that draft with Connor, because when you do have a player that you feel is a big value fall to you in that kind of spot, then you're not necessarily looking to say, okay, I want to draft the exact same way every time. I want to be, so locked in with my structure that I don't consider that player. You want to go through, and this is one of the things that's great with the tools, and especially kind of contrasting some of the tools with each other. The best ball tools there I'm speaking of is that you can see what approaches have worked in different years, that the specific year does have an influence on some of the structures that work. And then also there are lessons that transcend the year. So you want to be able to have set in your mind, which is which. But especially in Underdog, one of the cool things is there are multiple ways to approach it. And I think that you should try to take advantage of the specific players that are available in your draft with the specific constructions that maybe you're interested in trying. And so I like that element with Swift there. It does make it a little bit more interesting in terms of what's going to come back to us. Of course, Colm, what we're seeing now is that the second round has been almost all wide receivers, and there are going to be some intriguing running backs who do come back, not named DeAndre Swift.
Yeah, so Mike Evans, Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb have all gone off the board. Then we have Mark Andrews, Aaron Jones, the latest running back. We are 2 picks away. Nick Chubb goes off the board, and there's 1 pick before us. Javonte Williams is there. AJ Brown's also there, Shawn, who I think would be interesting on that pick. Is there anyone else standing out for you outside of those 2 names? Alvin Kamara is there and Leonard Fournette, but we have the Kamara situation where maybe it will be next year that suspension comes down, but still a little bit risky at this point. Who's standing out for you?
Well, Williams is the guy that Connor and I actually had number 1 for this particular spot, because if he does get most of the work, which I think is very possible, I mean, he's going to be the player who emerges this year there in Denver, then it just feels like an absolute home run from this spot. But AJ Brown, I mean, he's the guy when he comes back here, and right now ADP does put him in this range. I think you also have to consider those 2 players together. You prefer Williams or Brown here?
I think we'll go for Williams and hope that Brown makes it back to us. That could be very poor last words, but we also have T. Higgins, who is there as an option, and I think either of those coming back, and there's definitely going to be one of them comes back, because Leonard Fournette went off the board after Williams. We're waiting on 1 pick here at the turn, and then we'll have our option. AJ Brown, the clear choice for you over T. Higgins if both are there, and Saquon Barkley is also still there as well as an option.
Yeah, I'm just so tempted by Barkley here, Colm. I mean, there's a scenario, and it's not one that you have to go crazy out on a limb with to say, he's the 102 or 103 next year. But he does go in the interim. It's Fournette and Barkley. And so AJ Brown slides to us. I just feel like Ben Gretch would never forgive us if we passed on AJ Brown here.
Yeah, I think I would go AJ Brown as well. I think I talked with Zach on one of the recent shows, and we actually did a draft last week, and I think it might have been actually on the draft show that we talked about AJ Brown. I think that there's a bit of an overreaction here, and I think his ADP will creep back up as we get closer to the season. We'll hear more positive reports, but I think what he's been able to do in terms of efficiency, if he gets any more workload, even though we are afraid of the run-pass splits happening again in Philadelphia, I just think the Eagles are set up pretty well on offense this year. Higgins, then obviously we love T. Higgins, but he has the Jamar Chase obviously to contend with there as well. But Higgins does go in the next pick. I'm happy, Shawn, in these drafts, and I'm sure the listeners will probably know the players we're talking about. These are going to be the targets in these ranges, and there's going to be sometimes that Barkley does make it, and you got him in your last draft. He doesn't make it here, but we're happy to take AJ Brown. If AJ Brown hadn't got there, I'd been pretty happy to take T. Higgins. So we have our targets in those ranges, but the next player off the board was Kyle Pitts, and I think he's somebody who's still going to be very, very interesting moving forward this season. But Barkley did just go 1 pick before us, and I would have been very tempted to go back there and to take him. How do you feel about AJ Brown outside of Ben maybe not forgiving us if we didn't take him?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of upside there, right? If he stays healthy, he develops the rapport on field with Jalen Hurts. We know that these guys are very good friends. That part is exciting. We know they'll go out there and practice together some, right? I mean, I don't think that getting them on the field is going to be an issue. One of the things that was interesting is that when this trade was announced during the draft, when we were doing our live show, people were split, but I think more enthusiastic about Brown's landing spot than maybe you would have guessed. And then when we did the show again on live, when we did the show again on day 2 and had a little more chance to think about it, we were again pretty optimistic. And then when we had Matthew Friedman on just last week, and obviously more time to think about it, he was also very optimistic about a target increase for Brown and the chance to maintain at least some of the efficiency with that elite player there. And so I thought that kind of that progression was interesting. And like you say, I do think that his value there is going to creep back up a little bit as we see what the Eagles' plan is as the offseason develops. So, Colm, we're deep into round 3 here. Any surprises going off the board?
Well, I was going to mention to you back-to-back picks for the Chargers wide receivers. We had Mike Williams go 1 pick ahead of Keenan Allen. And I know Keenan Allen, somebody we've touched on recently, where his profile, there's kind of some concerns around him heading into this season. But about a round to 2 rounds early for Mike Williams, and he was somebody you did draft in your recent draft that we talked about in last week's show. How do you feel about Williams over Allen at that point of a draft?
I think it's a gutsy move, but one that could very easily pay off. Ben was talking about Allen on a recent episode of Stealing Bananas, mentioning that the target dominance starting to fade a little bit. We're not expecting crazy efficiency from him, even with Justin Herbert. It's really a tricky one because you'd actually like to have a third option that you could play in that offense. And that's one of the reasons why I've been taking a lot of Gerald Everett, even though I think that the chances that Everett breaks out are still, not great. I mean, it's not the odds-on thing to happen, but the pricing there for him is so good that because you have this elite quarterback and because Allen and Williams, neither one of those guys are really superstars at this point, there are targets available. And, maybe a lot of them will go to Austin Eckler, maybe Joshua Palmer will be the breakout, but there certainly is a scenario where we could see Gerald Everett more heavily involved.
We're looking now, we're 3 picks away from our next selection. Well, there's 3 picks in between. Amari Cooper went off the board, Ezekiel Elliott and J.K. Dobbins and DJ Moore just before that. So DK Metcalf is available. George Kittle's available. Chris Godwin, who's still coming back from his injury, is there. Lamar Jackson and Terry McLaurin go off the board. I was going to see with you, I know TJ Hawkinson's the guy that we're loving to target at the tight end position this year, but how do you feel about George Kittle at this point of the draft? Probably him or Metcalf are standing out at the top of the queue here for me at the moment, and Justin Herbert is there as well, but I would probably keep going with the pass catchers.
Yeah, I think that the issue here is that the wide receivers are gross, right? I mean, 3 of the top 5 wide receivers are Metcalf, Godwin, and Allen Robinson, all of whom have some pretty serious problems. George Kittle goes off the spot right before us. Colm, the pick that Connor and I were actually considering making, despite having the first 3 running backs at this point, was Breece Hall, and he didn't make it. Can I tempt you into taking a running back
Let's
here?
go. We have 6 seconds. Let's do it. We sometimes with these live drafts, it has to, we can do the case for why we will take Breece Hall maybe after we have the pick here at the turn now with the at the back end around the 412, then it'll be the 501, that'll be back to us. So maybe we'll talk about Breece Hall after that. But we have talked about him quite a bit over the last couple of months on the podcast. And I think it's going to be fun to talk about him in a moment. DK Metcalf goes off the board. You've mentioned then wide receivers being gross. Obviously, Jerry Jeudy had a little bit of an incident last week. We'll see what repercussions there are from that. He is one of the other wide receivers that's there. Shawn, who's your preferred option with this next pick?
Yeah, I would like to take one of the Broncos receivers. And so I'm willing to go either direction. I think that Jeudy has the most breakout star upside. We don't really know what is going to happen, with the off-field stuff.
The guy before us made the decision for us because he's Courtland Sutton. So
I was going to say, you're a Courtland Sutton fan, and I think that especially with the uncertainty right now, it makes sense to go with Sutton. We don't have this option. Call it Jerry Jeudy it is.
Yeah, so I am just out of interest on that one. We'll talk about Hall then. I am a Courtland Sutton guy, but I think both of these guys have a major upgrade at quarterback, so I'll be drafting both of them throughout the offseason. Good that Sutton is 1 year further removed from his injury. I think the tiebreaker for me at the moment would be the possibility of something coming down from the NFL on duty. It doesn't sound like there will be, but you never know. So when you're on the clock and they're both available, I probably would lean Sutton just over that. But I think there's a lot of upside for both of these guys. We've seen Russell Wilson with limited passing volume be able to support DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So I think this offense is going to be ready to hum once the season starts. The other player was Breece Hall, drafted to the Jets. Obviously, Michael Carter is there behind him in that offense. But we talked about it maybe a month to 2 months ago at this point, and we made the case that could he be somebody like a Jonathan Taylor coming in this class. I don't think he will be quite that, but the profile is very, very intriguing. I think taking him here is going to be nice.
I agree completely. And that's one of the things we've talked about from time to time, which is that don't avoid the running back in the dead zone if they shouldn't be there. And we don't know how this is going to develop. Patrick Crane, when he was on overtime, made the case that the Jets really are not a good team for him, even beyond the fact that they may not be that high scoring a team, that Michael Carter will be involved. I would expect Carter to be involved. I think that when you get to September, when you get to late August, you're going to have Breece Hall a round and a half higher than this. He's just too good. He's going to be the starter. He's going to get a lot of touches. I mean, one of the things that we know at this point is that, there's really a limit to how many touches you actually want the running back to have. So, is he going to kind of be in that range? I mean, you can do the Najee Harris thing, but it does increase your risk of injury. It does, to an extent, lower your ceiling a little bit from an efficiency perspective. You want to be getting those high value touches and you want to be making the most of them. I think that Hall can do that. And really either way, I think he's going to be more expensive. So we're getting a discount on him right now. And again, it's a situation where we didn't have players at other positions that were clear better options. And that's when you would make a break to take a player like Hall that you really believe in, especially again in this format where it's half PPR and those running backs who could blow up for multi-touchdown games in the playoffs do give you that advantage because you can come back then and select a lot of wide receivers. And that's the thing that can be tough, is that then when you have some running back options that you like late, it can be difficult to stick at the wide receiver position when those players maybe are not as exciting. As long as you do that, taking the running backs early here is a potential path to victory. We could look at this as being a situation where we actually got the 3 running backs in the first 3 rounds and then got AJ Brown on top of it. And that's obviously not what happened, but it's something that if we kind of fast forward to August, you might be looking at it from that perspective. And so, say, okay, well, you drafted a running back in the dead zone, but that's not going to be the repercussions of the actual move, especially if we draft well from this point on. So that's going to be the pressure that we have on us is to make sure that we now execute the things that we need to execute. Colm, what players are we seeing go now?
So we had Michael Thomas, Kyler Murray, Brandon Cooks, Josh Jacobs, AJ Dillon went off at the 6:05. We are 5 picks away. There's 2 quarterbacks at the top of the ADP queue as things stand. That's Joe Burrow and Jalen Hurts. But I don't know how you feel about it. I think if we could get Hurts to leak all the way back to us here and pair him up with AJ Brown, could be quite interesting. Tom Brady goes off the board with that next pick. Then we have Elijah Mitchell as an option. Elijah Moore is there as well, both the Elijahs. Is there anyone else, Shawn, standing out for you as Amon-Ra St. Brown goes off the board? And the other question is Jalen Hurts. Is he somebody who interests you at this point?
I think we would probably still want to go with Burrow. As if he lasts, Russell Wilson is kind of interesting with having Jerry Jeudy there. But one of the things that I'm looking to do, and again, this is based on some research in our tools, is ideally to have a running quarterback as your first quarterback, and then to have a plus passing quarterback as your second QB, and perhaps match him with a less expensive member of his receiving core, the wide receiver 2, for example. Now, some of those things are going to be a little bit easier to execute in a slow draft when you have, many, many hours to kind of sit back and plot all of the different scenarios, and even just to make the right choice, when you're on the clock there for that particular pick, much less looking back and looking forward. But QB does become interesting here. Joe Burrow does go 2 picks ahead of us. I might be tempted to get a little bit more receiving firepower. Now, Hurts also goes off, so we don't have that option. Colm, we're not that far away from where TJ Hawkinson would be picked. If we select him, then we don't have to worry about the big tier break after him. Tight ends are pretty inexpensive, and so there's not price pressure necessarily to select him here, but he does give us flexibility.
I can't break your heart, Shawn. I'll let you take TJ. I was wondering what would happen there if I said no. It would be very disappointing for the the rest of the show with Shawn being very upset. But the other players now that we do have an option, and part of the reason to go Hawkinson there is I've talked about the break and the tiers after you go past him for tight end. I think it's very important to get him. That's why I was touching on George Kittle earlier in the draft in case somebody did take Hawkinson between then and now. But we are back on the clock. DeAndre Hopkins goes off the board. But we do have 2 rookie options in Drake London and Treylon Burks. We have Elijah Moore and Devontae Smith. We already have AJ Brown. So I would be leaning here towards Moore, London, or Burks. Have you a preference of one of those guys?
No. Who do you like? These guys are all good values right in this range. They would all add on to our team. London might give us...
I would go London. And I don't know how you feel about this now after I say London, but we did take Breece Hall, and we're excited about Breece Hall, but we also probably have some questions about the New York Jets offense as a whole. So I like Elijah Moore, but that would be the reason. I think London's going to go in, and Matthew Freeman was very, very positive on the outlook for him heading into the season and the volume that he's going to receive. Obviously, the Falcons do not have a lot of pass catching options. They don't have Calvin Ridley. They do have Kyle Pitts. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all revolves around. But, the Falcons over the last 3 to 4 weeks, all as they've done is sign very, very old, not very successful wide receivers to the roster. So, hopefully that means that we're going to see a lot of Drake London. Is that how you'd be looking at it between those guys? Because Burks goes in the next pick, then Devontae Smith, and then Elijah Moore. But like I said earlier, I'm happy to sprinkle those guys between drafts. But again, the draft I did with Zach last week, London was somebody we drafted as well.
And that was kind of the idea that I was thinking is let's not get too much Jets exposure here. I have a lot of Treylon Burks in the early going. So in this pick where the guys are going at very similar spots ADP wise, to be able to diversify a little bit and to get London there, the news on Burks on his first little workout with the team wasn't particularly positive. I don't think that we're in a world where that's going to knock him down in drafts very much. If it does, you would want to take that discount, but it was the perfect spot to get some London, who again, Blair Andrews has done some fantastic machine learning research on these wide receivers. London, Burks, really the 2 guys that stood out for him. Another player who stood out that we've been drafting in a ton of formats is Sky Moore, and he would be someone that we could look to draft at the next turn if he comes back around. His ADP suggests that he won't, and he's obviously a trendy player. Basically, you talk about him for a minute in order to get his selection.
He got drafted in the next pick, so he's already off the board.
He's gone there. Brandon Ayuk. Colm,
I always think the funny part about doing these drafts live versus recorded is if that was live, we would have thought somebody's listening in. But this is recorded, and it happened as Shawn talked about him. So I actually thought it was the perfect time to weigh up. We drafted Drake London. You talked about Sky Moore. Pete Overzet had a great clip last week, which I thought was hilarious, where he was talking about the UK's favorite wide receiver, Drake London. So I thought it really was awesome stuff. But when we look at the options, you were going to mention Brandon Ayuk. Ayuk came on quite strong last year versus where it started. I anyway will hold my hands up. I was extremely optimistic on Ayuk heading into the season. I was more optimistic on him than Deebo Samuel in most cases, and drafted him ahead of Deebo Samuel a lot last year. But the start of the season was an absolute disaster. So it did get a lot better as the season went on, and I think he would be interesting in this range. Hunter Renfro's there as well. Tyler Lockett's there as well, as Deshaun Watson and Dak Prescott have gone off the board. We are still 7 picks away, Shawn, so I do think that those wide receivers may be gone. And as we say that, Brandon Ayuk does go off the board. Who is standing out for you here in the, say the next 10 picks by ADP?
Well, one reason to pass on Elijah Moore is that Garrett Wilson is available later. And while we haven't seen him play at the NFL level, in some ways he's an even safer prospect than Moore certainly was. And even given the flashes that we got from Moore last year, you could make the case that Wilson is probably just as safe in 2022. And so I think we would have to consider him. The gap in dynasty ADP between London, Burks, and Wilson, I think makes sense. It's almost one of these situations that, even though it's very easy to see the volume case for London and Burks, and even the quarterback case for those two players, even though they don't have elite quarterback play, that when you contrast those issues with what Garrett Wilson is dealing with, you're like, I mean, that gap makes sense. But I think that he should be closer to them in redraft. He's a rookie wide receiver at this point that I would have expected to rise more. He's in the same basic vicinity with Chris Olave, who I think is just, a full level down, especially now that Jarvis Landry has been signed. Unfortunately, we do lose Wilson there. The drafter ahead of us reaches past Hunter Renfrow and Tyler Lockett, which is the move that we think was probably the right one to make. Colm, we don't have a QB. One of the things that we do know is that we want to have QB in the window in these underdog drafts as well. We have Matthew Stafford, Trey Lance as the top couple of guys. If you reach down a little bit lower, you get Derek Carr. Is this a case at all where you'd have some interest in going with both Stafford and Lance? There's a big tier break after those two quarterbacks are gone.
Yeah, what's interesting about Lance is we still don't know if he's going to be the starting option, for the 49ers. I think they will go with him, but I think that's something that we could do here. I definitely would go with Stafford as we are on the clock. I know you talked earlier about the opportunity to get a Russian quarterback and then pair him with somebody like a Stafford. I think ideally, that would be an option, that he might even be that second option. But the one concern I would have with Lance is if he doesn't become the starter, and this did happen as last year, is then that we're, probably having to have that third quarterback somewhere in this draft. But if you feel strongly that he's going to be that starting option, the upside is certainly there with him as the Russian quarterback.
Yeah, the issue that I have here is I don't think that there's a draftable wide receiver at this ADP. And so, Lance, if we knew for sure that there weren't going to be any issues with him holding that starting job, he would be, at least a round, if not 2.5 rounds more expensive. When you're trying to win the whole thing, as we are in this case, I think it makes sense to double dip at the QB position there. Give us that combination of elite passer and potentially elite runner. Obviously, it's still very speculative in terms of what Lance will actually be, the upside, tantalizing. So we make that move, again, in part because the board dictated it at other positions. We don't want to give away value to avoid taking the QBs if that means just taking guys that we personally have ranked much lower than what the draft slot would be here in order to get a wide receiver. So I like that move, and it's actually the second time recently that I've taken Lance, though I am worried about his situation. I don't think it's clear cut in any way, shape, or form, but you do have to make some of those gambles when the price is basically begging you to do it in the draft.
Yeah, I think it made a lot of sense there for us to do that. And I touched on it and you've touched on it. I have concerns as well. But look, if they're not going to start him this year, I think that we're looking at, a bust in big flashing letters. But I always find it very interesting, the conversation that happens with Jordan Love that doesn't happen with Trey Lance. But we'll see if Lance gets starting this season, because the 49ers give up a hell of a lot to actually acquire him. Derek Carr did go in the middle of this round at the 906. I know he's somebody you really like. Chase Edmonds went before that. Dallas Goedert just before that. But Russell Gage now with the Buccaneers went at the 907, and then Alan Lazard at the 908. I know we're looking, there's no Devontae Adams there, and I love Alan Lazard as a player for the Packers, but I think that's a real early spot when people are targeting him there. You mentioned that there was no kind of wide receivers that you were looking to take at that kind of last set of picks for us. The last one of those that would have been kind of close to the top is Chris Olave. He's after going off at the 909, then Michael Gallup, and still on the board we have the likes of Robert Woods and Chase Claypool. Is Claypool somebody who starts to get to that point where you're like, well, that might be interesting, or are we looking at all those names that I've kind of leaned out there as players that we're not targeting. The other one that did go off the board was Christian Kirk, who I know we're not very excited about, even though the Jaguars give him a huge amount of money this offseason. The player in this range that might be interesting, even though we've gone running backs earlier, is Kareem Hunt and Devin Singletary. I think both could be interesting.
They could. And we know we're looking to get to 4 running backs. If we have 4 powerful running backs, then, that's better than not. So again, it's this question of what are you giving up at wide receiver? If it truly is flat, even if the roster construction explorer encourages you to look at a different position there, if you're just actually giving up value on your board to hit the right construction, then that's not the way you play it, right? So we have to kind of merge those two instincts, or those two objectives. In this case, Kadarius Toney, somebody I think has been pushed way down and still has this contingency-based extreme upside. He's somebody I'd be looking at. Tyler Boyd, a player that Connor and I selected. His ADP is absurd. And so, again, these are the types of players where we're thinking, okay, now that you're in this range, the value is very, very good. Rondell Moore, another player. He shouldn't still be available at this point. We're not saying that he's going to be a superstar, that we're necessarily right, but the price that you're being asked to pay in order to find that out is very favorable, because if he does break out, there are just so many different ways within the context of this offense that he would score a lot of points and be the fantasy factor. The second-year wide receivers are so expensive now because people understand that hitting them is a key part of building dominant teams. We talked a little bit about that with the 0 RB special early in the week. But that's why you have to be willing to take some of these guys who are a little bit unpopular and could do some of these things, because they're the ones where you still have that massive ADP gap in terms of what the price says that they're going to do and what they could do. It doesn't make sense to draft trendy players who already have all of that upside priced in at the point that you actually do go and get them. I like both of these guys in this context to have at least the potential to outperform, especially when you contrast them with some of the really unfavorable names that come up afterward. And we're quickly moving into the low ceiling portion of the draft after this. And just as a quick update, Tyler Boyd did go off the board.
Yeah, and when we look at it as well, just through the players that are available and looking at builds, we started off with the running backs earlier in the draft, but I think when we look at it, the options there that I mentioned, the likes of Singletary, the likes of Hunt, there's a real nice option there in the kind of 9th, 10th round for your kind of 0 RB builds as well. And in this range too, you mentioned the flat kind of disgusting area wide receiver that we have kind of weighted our way through with the quarterbacks. There is some nice wide receiver options here in this round as well. But you mentioned before we started about the possibility of having like the 106 as your kind of ideal pick for this. That would have given us some flexibility. But now we are in a situation where both Rondell Moore and Kadarius Toney are there. Shawn, I'm going to say that my dream scenario here is that we get both of those guys in these next 2 picks. Who do you want to prioritize over the other here?
Well, even though Toney has been going earlier, he seems so unpopular that I think he has the better chance to fall through. I think maybe we take Rondell Moore. He's the player I'm higher on, so it would make less sense probably to miss him.
Yeah, no, let's go Moore. And the other thing I'm looking at, and it mightn't matter, but the team picking here after us at the back end of the round here at the 10-12, and then again at the 11-01, they have 5 receivers so far, but they do take Toney, so that didn't matter. They now have a 1-3-6-0 build, and they take Pat Fairmouth, which is a nice tight end to pick up at that point, Shawn. So we're back on the clock. Kenny Golladay, is there any other options that are piquing your interest?
Well, we could go with a tight end. It's never too early to take Albert O. It's also a situation where I think that either Jarvis Landry or Jamison Crowder is really interesting here. Crowder, a way to get some leverage off of those more popular
Crowder, yeah.
Those more popular Bills wide receivers. He's basically a good version of Cole Beasley, right? Now, there are ways that this team could evolve this season to where they don't need him at all. And so then you lose even kind of the floor element there. But one of the things that Connor and I talked about a lot as we were making these picks and actually selected both Boyd and Crowder is that these guys end up being devalued in best ball leagues beyond where their scoring actually suggests they should go. They both still have the potential to score touchdowns. They're both with elite quarterbacks. And when people are trying to figure out a way to have a team that's in the finals that is different than the rest of the group, if you're thinking that a lot of the teams that get through will be Diggs, Allen, Davis teams in some way, shape, or form, if you're thinking that at least one of the likely scenarios, we don't know how the Bills will play in the fantasy semifinals. We don't know how the Bengals will play in the fantasy semifinals. But if you're looking at the Bengals and Burrow, Chase, Higgins as players who are very likely to factor into that, one of the ways that you can gain some leverage on them is to draft Tyler Boyd and Jamison Crowder, guys who in a specific game could end up with a lot of receptions. They could get that touchdown. Obviously, Connor defeated us in the FFPC final last year, specifically because Tyler Boyd did score a touchdown. I mean, that was the margin that we lost by, right? And so Boyd, I think his ADP is really silly, but Jamison Crowder, a player that I actually think there's a scenario where he's more valuable than Boyd, a scenario where he actually becomes a target hog in that offense. I'm not saying it's the most likely scenario, but at this price, when you're looking at that kind of player, I definitely want to take that gamble, at least on some of these teams.
Yeah, and I think like what you're talking about there, sometimes we talk about big gap and small gap running backs, and when we see that with wide receivers, we talked about T. Higgins, I believe it was in the 3rd round, Jamar Chase going in the 1st round, so the gap down to Tyler Boyd then is obviously significant, and then we look at Diggs to Davis, and the thing keeps striking with me with Gabriel Davis heading into the season. I really like Gabriel Davis, and I drafted him all last offseason, was hoping for a big season for him in 2021. When we look back at the season as a whole, he had 35 receptions, just over 500 yards and 6 touchdowns, but he obviously had the massive playoff game, but he also had big games towards the end of the previous season. And, does Crowder go in there and, just simply outscore him on the season? I think you could be getting a huge value there at the ADP that he is going at. So I've always thought that Crowder was like a poor man's Jarvis Landry kind of, and I think that he could be very interesting in that Bills offense, because we know that Josh Allen doesn't pass to the running backs a lot, but he does like to scramble, and those short to intermediate passes to somebody like a Crowder could be really worthy in this offense. So we are now 9 picks away, Shawn. The question we have a bit of time I'm going to ask you, we did pass up on Cousins as a potential 3rd quarterback. I'm asking you the question now, are we going to risk it here and settle on the 2 quarterbacks, take the upside approach and chance it with Lance, unless something falls to us perfectly? The other player that would be coming up here is Justin Fields, who just goes off the board, but I have a lot of concerns around the Bears offense this season, and I think that'll obviously affect Fields. So are you happy to roll with 2 quarterbacks in this draft, or are you thinking about adding a 3rd at some point?
I think since we got the 2 guys in the window and both of them have extreme upside, Matthew Stafford is not a player that I'm drafting a lot or targeting. He's a little bit trickier in that, Cooper Kupp, you've got to take with a top 3 or 4 pick, Allen Robinson overvalued. And so you have that situation where if you want to pair him with one of those receivers, then, that part of it becomes very expensive. And so, we're looking at going empty here with the quarterbacks. I like that. That's another way in which you can actually be different, because stacking is so popular. And one of the things that we do see again in the tools is that there are benefits depending on how you do it, but it also can be a little bit overstated. If you assume that the vast majority of the teams that are going to be through there are Stafford with Kupp or Stafford with Robinson, then there's some advantage to being the team that has Stafford. Maybe the game goes in a little bit different fashion, or maybe just the rest of your team is able to overcome and you benefit from Stafford getting you there or Lance getting you there. One of the things that was interesting last season was that those top 3 teams in the FFPC finals, all of them had Burrow, but the other 2 teams had Chase, and obviously Connor's had both Chase and Boyd. We were able to overcome one of those Burrow Chase teams and, a Jarvis Landry touchdown at the end there. We overcome the other one. I'm not saying that you necessarily want to go out of your way to not have your quarterbacks paired up, but it's another thing that you can do. And my main point is don't give away a ton of value thinking that you have to have that in there as part of it. We see in the tools that there are other ways to do it. But I think that once we've made that move with Stafford and Lance, we have to kind of stick with it. The tools are very clear that if you take the 2 QBs in the window, that you don't want to take another one. Colm, we're back on the clock and the top running backs are Michael Carter, Isaiah Spiller. This is a sort of a weird section at wide receiver, but DJ Chark and Van Jefferson. So we could put, that third wide receiver with Stafford if we wanted. We could take Irv Smith. We can take Hunter Henry. Which direction would you like to go?
I think I would go Isaiah Spiller here, unless you're going somewhere else, as we have 2 seconds left on the clock. Interested to find out what your thoughts will be in a minute on taking that pick, as things have gone rapid fire and Michael Carter and Irv Smith have come off the board and we're back on the clock again. We missed out on Albert O. Hunter Henry is there as an option at tight end. Is there any other players? Pickens is there as well. I'll let you pick this since I jumped on the Spiller one.
I like the move here with DJ Chark. He's a player who I think is going to really find his second wind in this Detroit Lions offense. There could end up being a ton of competition if Jameson Williams is healthy early enough in the season to emerge as sort of a co-number one with the three of them. Then that's going to reduce the ceiling specifically for Chark, who you would kind of imagine is going to be the number three, at least long-term in this offense. But one of the things they've been talking about with his situation, one of the reasons why he signed with Detroit, one of his frustrations with Jacksonville, is they were using him on a lot of vertical routes to clear out for other receivers. And if you think that you can be the guy, and Chark was in that one fleeting season with the Jaguars, you want the routes to be designed such that you are also a focal point at times. And he believes he's going to be more of that with the Detroit Lions. You could also look at it from the perspective that if teams adjust and are looking to stymie that elite run that Amon-Ra St. Brown went on at the end of last season, and he's sort of the defensive focal point to start out 2022, Chark might be the guy who is able to develop a rapport with Jared Goff. Goff actually played okay down the stretch. There might be some chances for some shots. Once he establishes himself there in the first month, perhaps more of that leaks through than maybe, again, the pricing indicates here. Not a lot of other great receiving options, but Van Jefferson would have been a possibility. Will Fuller has not signed yet, but I still think it's an interesting guy. Jarvis Landry was the player I was hoping would get back to us. He went a little bit before our pick. I think he's the preferred way to play the New Orleans Saints when you look at the different ways that offense could play out and the prices of the three main receivers there. Jahan Dotson, just another interesting guy. We're not high on him, but when you're looking at the receivers, and again, in these tournaments, we're focusing on players who actually have a wide range of outcomes, even if the floor isn't that great. We don't want to reach for them, but when they fall like Dotson does in most of these formats, then that portion of it is a little bit interesting. You mentioned that we had lost tight end. Gerald Everett and Noah Fant, our favorite guys, would be two players who might come back around.
That was what I was wondering when I was mentioning those players earlier. You obviously have the board up in front of you as the latest ADP, and I'm going through an Excel sheet that I have here from a couple of days ago, and I was thinking, wonder where Everett is on this board for Shawn when I mentioned those tight ends. So yeah, I definitely think both of those guys. Hopefully we get at least one of them. You never know, possibly dipping to two of them. But you mentioned Jahan Dotson. He is now still on the board. His ADP is 142. We are at pick 158 as things stand, and we are 9 picks away. So if he did get back, I think that he would be somebody there. You mentioned Will Fuller not having signed. We are kind of at his ADP, but by the time we pick, we'll be about 10 picks past that. Obviously, the concern, there is a lot of these wide receivers. Will Fuller's obviously younger than the likes of Julio Jones, but there's a lot of these guys who haven't got signed yet. But Jarvis Landry was one of those who fell into a pretty solid landing spot with the Saints. So it's always that thing of, drafting them when they're not signed versus, waiting to make sure they do actually get signed somewhere. Dotson does go about around after his ADP, but we'll be waiting here to see. So Shawn, Will Fuller, I mentioned they're not being signed. Is that any concern of you, taking him at this point? And then you mentioned the tight ends. I think they are the guys that we do really want to get. But the other question I do have for you is Odell Beckham also goes off the board, and Van Jefferson. Odell Beckham being one of those guys who isn't signed as well. Jarvis Landry was the guy last year who kind of could have, in the second half of the final game of the season, got us to that first place he didn't do that. Are we putting that firmly now on Baker Mayfield? Have we forgiven Jarvis Landry at this point?
You got to forgive Jarvis, right? I mean, he's one of the best wide receivers of the last decade, and Baker Mayfield probably hasn't earned that type of congratulations yet. We'll see how this develops. I do like the situation there with the New Orleans Saints. I'm skeptical about that offense in general, but I do think there'll be some playable pieces, right? So we'll see how he's able to work his way into the rotation there. You get the impression that Michael Thomas definitely still has some questions, which is not the case that I think you want to have if you are buying Thomas in some of these drafts. Colm, we're close again. Fuller's still there. Joshua Palmer, we mentioned that situation with the Chargers. We might take that shot with Gerald Everett instead. KJ Hamler, one of our favorites. Robbie Anderson, one of our favorites. We talk about some of these deep threats getting overdrafted at times in the best ball leagues, but I do think that when you have a chance to get some decent values on them, like we did with Chark, like we could potentially have with Hamler and Anderson, you don't want to pass those up either. A couple of rookies, Jalen Tolbert and Wan'Dale Robinson. Already the puff pieces on Wan'Dale have been very enthusiastic, and he's a guy where I've just been stunned at where he's going in rookie drafts. It's been much too low.
Yeah, I think he's much too low as well. And he is somebody that I think, you mentioned a couple of names there. We can't not get KJ Hamler here in this draft, if anything is possible. But we are back on the clock, and Taysom Hill has gone off the board. Am I making a mistake here, or is Gerald Everett, has he just disappeared into thin air?
Well, he goes very late, right? He goes very late, and so I'll have a lot. It'll probably be the wrong play. It'll probably be my version of the Fantasy Douches Jared Cook, the tilting at windmills. You can tilt at them too, I guess. Tilting at windmills kind of throughout the player's career. But yeah,
I'm just going to say this: if Taysom Hill is going ahead of Gerald Everett, I don't think that's going to play out to the Taysom Hill's drafters' advantage this season. I was just
hard
like,
to say, right?
Fanta's gone off the board. Fanta's gone off the board. Now Taysom Hill is gone off the board. Where is Gerald Everett? I joked on this on the recent draft I did with Zach. Sometimes when we're doing these drafts, I'm wondering, have we missed some critical news? Has something happened since we started drafting? But Sammy Watkins goes off the board. Jameis Winston went off the board just before that. We're back on the clock. Kenneth Gainwell is here, and he's somebody that you and Ben talked about recently. How are you feeling about Gainwell at this point?
I think we need to make sure we get the rest of our wide receivers. The 4 running backs are probably the limit with that particular start. I don't know. We've got to get Hamler and Jerry Jeudy there. We're gonna have that Denver Broncos offense covered. Yeah, I think we want to stay at the 4 running backs. Is that unless we get to the last pick and running back is so clearly better. But one of the things that Blair talked about in his early underdog piece is that hyperfragile is possible, but you have to stop. You got to stop taking those running backs. You've got to fill up the wide receiver position with so many guys, and it can be tempting to think, okay, these wide receivers will never run out, but then you get into this stretch here where we're in the 15th round now. Anybody who has lost track a little bit of where that we are, but between our picks at the beginning of round 15, at the end of round 16, a big chunk of these top wide receivers will go. And so we'll start to have to potentially look quite deep as we fill out our last 3 slots.
Yeah. And just out of interest, with say a different build, Gainwell, I think is somebody that I'd be targeting there. Just for people listening, Gainwell would be somebody you're targeting there if it wasn't the case that we had the 4 running backs already.
Very definitely. And it may be a situation where it would have been preferable to grab him at that spot and take a wide receiver where we took Isaiah Spiller. But I do like Spiller. And if one of these sort of backup running backs ends up benefiting from an injury, and again, an injury we hope that doesn't happen, Spiller is just very easy to see as, a running back 10 over the second half of the season. And you say, well, that seems a little bit high. There are some other good guys, but think of how high Rashad Penny and Devin Singletary, Sony Michel finished in the fantasy playoffs last season when a guy with starter talent falls into that starting role and gets hot at the right moment, once the starter is not in the equation, sometimes the workload profile is actually a little bit better for the backup than it is for the starter. Obviously, that's an argument for zero RB as opposed to our hyper fragile approach, but it is one of the reasons why I liked Isaiah Spiller where we selected him. Colm, we're right now with the first pick in round 16. That's where the draft is. We have 11 picks to wait on. The top of our board, or the players that I've at least put in the queue right now, are Joshua Palmer, Robbie Anderson, Julio Jones, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Laviska Shenault. Some of those guys will probably be picked, but who do you like for our selections at 16, 17, if they do last?
Yeah, Robbie Anderson did just go off on that next pick. Zamir White went just before that. I just want to say on Gainwell again, he went almost 20 spots after his ADP in this one, so almost 2 rounds. I think he's somebody that we should be targeting throughout the offseason. I think it's a good spot. Can you just run through those names again for me, Shawn, as I was looking through the draft list? You mentioned Shenault, and then I seen all I could hear was Shenault after that point.
That makes sense. No, Curtis Samuel, Donovan Peoples-Jones, John Mechie, those are the top 3 in terms of best available. Our players in the queue are Julio Jones, Wan'Dale Robinson, Shenault, and then as people are getting picked, I've added AJ Green, James Washington, and the Packer, Romeo Doubs.
Yeah, I think some of these rookies are where I'd be trying to tack on towards the end of the draft. I think just the upside, and you mentioned the puff pieces around Wan'Dale Robinson. I think that that's what's going to happen over the next 3 months or so. We're going to hear these coming out. We're going to see rounds and 2 rounds and 3 round jumps on some of these players, and that's going to be very good for us drafting them at this point. So I would be leaning towards the rookies as we play things out. Dobbs has been getting some interesting reviews. I know you've been digging into him over the last couple of weeks since he was drafted, and I think nothing may happen, but the upside is sky high with him heading into this season. I obviously want Christian Watson to come in and have a great start as a Packer, but it feels like it mightn't be all that surprising if Dobbs hits the ground running and is there ahead of him. Curtis Samuel did go off the board. Are you feeling, before we get back on our pick as Donovan Peoples-Jones goes, that we should lean towards the rookies here to finish things out?
Well, I mean, Dobbs is probably a little bit more of an 18th round pick, but the rest of the guys are more or less going. I think the AJ Green with the DeAndre Hopkins suspension is interesting just from the perspective of he's going to get you a few touchdowns in all likelihood. And so if you're trying to bank those points in a situation where you're drafting 10 wide receivers, he wouldn't make sense in a different type of build, but he's a little bit interesting here. The main thing was my heart was beating very fast, Colm, very fast, as we were waiting for Wan'Dale to either be available or not be available. He did make it to our pick. We are selecting him, and we can breathe easy.
Yeah, no, he was the one we were hoping to see what he last 2 there at this point. Now, J.D. McKissick was off the board. One more pick before it's back to us. There was a couple of players there that you did touch on, like Peoples-Jones. Not all that excited heading into this season for a couple of those names that we mentioned. John Menchie's there as well. Just, obviously somebody's going to score points for the Houston Texans this season, but will it be many points? It doesn't really feel like it. Jared Goff goes off the board now, Shawn, so we have our options again. Who are we looking at here?
Well, I think this probably comes down to Laviska Shenault versus James Washington, right? Washington, a player who was buried behind good wide receivers in Pittsburgh and a bad QB. And so that combination is really the worst. He's going to not be buried, at least at the start of the season, and have a much better quarterback in Dallas. So that's an interesting play. But, I mean, do we want to pass on Shenault?
Well, I'll let you do it. You can break my heart if you want. And Shawn goes with Shenault as I think that's, and I was joking earlier with the TJ Hawkinson pick because I wanted TJ Hawkinson every bit as much as Shawn wanted to draft him. But I don't think I'll be able to give up Shawn. It would be one thing if Shenault was going in the 12th round, 13th round. He's going here at the 1702. And last season I was drafting him, I think maybe up as far as the 5th round at one point, which just obviously didn't work out last season. Do you think there is hope of a reclamation project there? You mentioned the situation of the bad quarterback situation stuck behind wide receivers in Pittsburgh for Washington. But, that last season for Jacksonville with Urban Meyer there was just, I don't know, couldn't have gone any worse. You have a first round or top pick in the draft coming in as a proposed generational quarterback, and just everything falls apart. Obviously, we have Etienne, who missed the entire season through injury, but I'm still holding out some hope there for Laviska Shenault.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because you look at what he did last year, and he did not get open down the field, and he did not catch the ball well anywhere. And so when you're talking about upside,
he got himself into such a situation that you're starting to tout AJ Green ahead of him. That's
well, to be clear, we did not draft AJ Green, but yeah. So I mean, I think you have to be realistic about it. One of the pieces that Curtis was working on at one point, I think something came up. We didn't get it published at that juncture, but looking at some of these wide receivers who broke the most tackles and gained the most yards after contact, a little bit different than after the catch. Using the advanced stat explorer that we have, which is such a cool tool to have there, Shenault still shows up. And that's one of the things that people are looking for from him, is to be a physical wide receiver, to catch the ball, to generate yards after the catch, and to fill that role for a team. Now, when I'm looking at Shenault, I'm thinking a little bit about being on Tyler Boyd going in his third year when he was, virtually free. You can go back a little bit longer and you can think of the situation where, Devontae Adams did not break out through his first 2 seasons, and people were looking at that as a bust.
Nobody wanted him.
Yeah, well, not a bust maybe at the level of Shenault still, but a player who was like very much just a guy. Now, You can always go through and look at the handful of examples that would point to someone having the chance to break out. That doesn't mean that they're likely to break out or likely to be good. But with Shenault, one of the things that has happened here is that the Jaguars did not actually add good wide receivers. And so he still is in a situation where if he himself plays well, there's an opportunity, and that's what you want. And I think that there is the potential for that. If that happens and we start to get news to that effect, then he can stay in Jacksonville and have his price rise dramatically. Now, dramatically, it's still going to be pretty inexpensive, but a 2, 3, 4 round rise, you get a little bit of a benefit from that if you draft early. The other thing that could happen is the overall offense could be vastly improved. And as you mentioned, Trevor Lawrence could take a step forward, which would help all of those players tremendously. And then there's still the slight potential that he would get moved. Now, we expected that to happen at this point. If it were going to happen, that doesn't mean that it's completely ruled out. If he does move to a different team, then a lot of the situations he could potentially move to would be kind of fun, right? And you're thinking a fresh start. This team wants him. This team thinks that they know how to use him. That's going to give him a little bit of a bump too. So I think there's room for his price to rise. There's definitely room for him to outperform it, since, at this point, he's not free. These players here, you still need to make good picks, but it's not like you're passing on some other star at this price. So I think that there are a lot of things still in play to where he makes sense in fantasy. We've got to be realistic. It's probably not going to pay off, but we're trying to get a lot of different shots with our 10 wide receivers.
Yeah, I think, and I'm looking at this point for upside, young players and upside, and obviously not technically as young as a rookie would be coming in here, but I still think there is upside. I'm hoping that there's upside there for Trevor Lawrence. So, he's going to, if he does step forward this year, it's going to have to bring a couple of those pass catchers with him in terms of overall trajectory. We are, Shawn, now 4 picks away. We have 2 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, 9 wide receivers, 2 tight ends at this point. So, Shawn, we're into the final pick now off the draft. It is the 18-11. We have 2 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, 9 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends. There was a run of tight ends there in Brevin Jordan, Austin Hooper, and Cameron Brate. We are 2 picks away. Are we looking to get that 10th wide receiver, or is there any options here of tight end that would be of interest?
I don't think so. I think that anything we might have wanted to do to add another QB or tight end has dried up. And so we're down to the last pick, only 1 pick ahead of us. And I think there are 3 names here that are pretty fun. 3 rookie wide receivers: Romeo Doubs, who we talked about at the last draft spot potentially, and then Tyquan Thornton, who is a top 50 overall selection for the New England Patriots, a vertical threat, someone that you could easily see Mac Jones creating a rapport with early. And again, you don't want to overpay for vertical wide receivers in best ball, but if they do fall to you at the very end, you have to at least consider them. And then Khalil Shakir is an interesting player since we took Jamison Crowder. He would be the guy that pushes Crowder out in all likelihood. I mean, there are some scenarios where they could play together. There are some scenarios where a different player would get hurt, but you would definitely be in position to benefit from that third Buffalo receiver if you went that route. I like all three of these guys, Colm. Who do you prefer?
I was going to say, you let me take Visca, so you can pick here. I would lean Dubs, but yeah, that's but I didn't know how you were going to feel. Did you do that pick just because of it being Green Bay related, or how did you come to that? Do you have him ahead of those other two guys?
I think all three of those picks would be good. And I did select Dubs because I'm drafting with a Green Bay Packers super fan. It wouldn't be very friendly to go with a Patriot or a Bill when we have a Packers guy there. And I like that play. I think that there is the potential for him to be the guy in Green Bay this season. Now, one of the things that we're probably looking at if Christian Watson does not emerge is that nobody will really end up being the guy. And you've got kind of this mismatch of, let's say, wide receiver threes who are out there all doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And the offense flows a little bit more through the running backs and flows through Aaron Rodgers' genius as opposed to through any sort of dominant wide receiver. At the same time, love the profile. He's somebody who's written about multiple times on the site. He's one of the guys I feature in my discount rookie article where I'm looking at guys you can select if you don't have a first round pick and potentially get at least the value, maybe more if things break the right way. So we do like Dubs. We like that situation. And as we close out the draft in the 18th round with our 10th wide receiver, I think any of those three guys will work. Obviously, if we have the wrong one in week 17 and fall from $2 million to $1 million because we selected the wrong round 18 wide receiver, will be disappointed. I mean, splitting 1 million does not go as far, but you got to live with your choices.